Hi and welcome. I'm down here in my wormery and I got a little project that I want to embark on today. Nothing too special, but basically I want to collect up some worms, and I was trying to decide which of my bins would be best to take worms from. Basically I've got two bins that are my oldest bins that I know have lots of worms in them. However, those bins have really been getting geared up for migration and for depopulation. There have been no fresh feedings in these bins for some time now. And it's usually at the fresh feedings where you would expect that the worms would be kind of, piled into a specific spot. It's not entirely true. The second oldest bin was actually set up with its first migration only 3 days ago to try to get the worms to start collecting into one single spot. But after only 3 days, I'm skeptical as to whether that would be a good bin to try to collect worms from. And in the older bin, that bin has just been getting starved for the past couple weeks or so now. So there's been no focused feeding there. So my guess there too is that the worms are probably just scattered all over the place, which would make it a little bit more difficult to collect them up. So in my mind, it seemed like even though those two bins are the most heavily populated of my bins and could probably spare the greatest number of volunteer worms to be extracted from them, I'm steering my attention to my two younger red wiggler worm bins, because I think since it was only a week ago that I fed those bins, yeah, it was 7 days ago, I think I can anticipate that right where those feedings occurred a week ago is where I could probably round up the largest number of worms the most quickly without making it into a big production. And I've decided that those are the bins that I'm going to focus my attention on. So I did put together a little bit of a plan over here, and it really just outlines the two bins that I've got on my sites today. They're the August 21 and the September 22 bins. They're the ones over there, the August 21, September 22. And it just gives some information about how old the bins are: 66 days of age, 34 days of age, and how many feedings each bin has received. But the bottom line is, all I'm after today is to extract some worms from each of those tubs, and then I'll have some room left in there by having, taken out a number of worms. And since it's been a week since they were fed, they're due for some fresh food anyway. So I'm just going to replenish the food as well as rebuild the bedding in those bins to let them continue on. Because, as you can tell, they're not very old bins yet, so they're quite a way, I think. Not quite a way, but they're still a way away from, being ready for harvest. So I just wanted to also bring the camera in a little bit closer, because in my two older bins, I noticed something a little unusual. Lately, I've been getting a lot of questions about, hey, how do I keep my worms in my bins? Because they, people notice that I don't use lids, and they also notice that I don't have, worm tracks running up all of my bins. But it was funny, when I came down here today, I did actually notice that in my oldest bin, I believe it's the oldest bin, is where it looks like the worms have actually decided in this one spot for some reason to have sort of an exodus. And since I see fewer worm castings on this side, it's my assumption that they were just crawling over the partition, coming down into this bin for some reason. Then the other thing that I'm noticing in here, and I think this has been this way only for a few days since the last time I checked in here, and this paper was still whole, for whatever reason, it seems like the worms, maybe they came down onto the paper and just decided they're going to drill right through there, and it just seems so unusual. I never see anything like this down here, so I just figured I'd show it really quick, and I'd be curious to see if anyone else has had anything like that happen in their bins. I know most people run lids on their bins. I do things a little differently. I run my bins without lids, but in general, I think that's the main reason I don't see worms trying to exit my bins, is because the walls are all dry, because they're not within an enclosed space where the moisture can evaporate and condense and collect back on the walls. Because in my mind, it's really the collecting moisture on the walls of the containers that tends to draw the worms out of the bed. I don't think it's some sort of a flee or run or escape type mentality. I believe all the worms are really trying to do is go after the moisture. But in this case, I really have no clear understanding as to why this could have happened right here. So I'm just curious if anyone's ever seen anything like that, and if they have, I'd just like to know about it, or if there's any theories as to why. this might have occurred. So it just seemed like a little bit of an oddity I would, bring to everyone's attention because it is interesting. But at this point, it's on to the August 21 bin and the September 22 bin to get some worm volunteers out of there, and then we'll do a quick feeding and reset on those. So let's get to work. So now very often you see me adding dry brown leaves to my worm bins as bedding, but right now it's autumn in my region and all the leaves are starting to shed off of their trees and land out in my yard. So I've got this plentiful supply of freshly fallen leaves that are still kind of interesting fall colors. So rather than just those boring brown leaves that I usually use as bedding, I thought I would change things up today and run outside, and as you can see they're all wet, it's drizzling outside. I figured I'd just grab some nice fresh damp freshly fallen autumn leaves to include as bedding in today's feeding. So I thought that would kind of add a nice little splash of color to today's work. The food itself that they're getting is perhaps not as interesting in color. It's just some stems and leaves from some produce that was used to prepare a dish recently, and this is just the leftover stuff. And I might have gone a little bit less on today's portion than I've been feeding recently. I just feel like I've been feeding a little bit perhaps too generously lately, so I thought I'd scale back a little bit. And besides, I did bring a fair number of leaves down here which I'd like to completely use up as well, so I think it should be a pretty good mix. So this is the 34-day-old bin that we're going to start with. Let's see what we're greeted with when we first arrive. Well, we've got ourselves a few worms that are out here to partake in the moisture that collects right under the plastic. They really seem to be enjoying it. There's also always like a good plentiful amount of freshly deposited castings right there too on the surface as a result of the worms coming up to enjoy the moisture while they're hanging out up there. They kind of do their thing there, and then that's what you see right there, right along the top. If this were to go maybe another week, the whole surface could be potentially just covered in fresh castings. But I always seem to check in pretty frequently, so in most cases I don't get that. Also noticing some of this white mold that we noticed previously. Some people had suggested that that's probably because I had fed bread not too long ago. And that seems like a really valid hypothesis. I have no way to test that or prove it or disprove it, but it seems very valid. Bread's one of those things that I don't really feed very often. So to see something different in the form of mold like that, seems realistic to think that that might be the explanation. And mold is fine. The worms are going to eventually eat that too. So I don't worry about that stuff growing in here. In fact, I consider it a good thing. So now I'm going to gear up for an immediate collection starting of worms when I get into here. Because I think once we start excavating the center, which is where I last fed, and that's generally where I feed, I think we're going to start encountering a fair number of worms. I'm not going to go too picky on picking them out. I'm just going to scoop as many as I can. And then I think once they've tried to dive down into the material to avoid the bright lights overhead, I'll be able to skim off some of the stuff that's not worms from above, and hopefully what we'll be left with on the bottom is mainly worms. So let's start clearing things aside here. Yeah, you see there's some of the mold that was growing on the bread that had been fed in here recently. The food was placed into these bins in the form of like little bundles of kind of worm. That's a nice number of worms right there already on the first handful. So I was using newspaper to create little bundles of food for these little guys, because the food itself generally counts as a great source of nitrogen for the worms, but to keep their food supply well balanced, you want to complement the nitrogen food source with a carbon-rich food source. And in the case of your worm bins, that's typically the bedding you use, whether it's cardboard or paper or leaves. Whatever the case may be, that's what's considered as the carbon food source. And by wrapping the food right up into little bundles using newspaper, you're, automatically adding a good amount of carbon-rich food, which also doubles nicely as bedding. So I'm trying to see if there's any signs of those paper bundles. I'm pretty sure these were, yeah. I'm fairly sure that the food was administered in the form of bundles recently. And when you do that, you'll find little chunks of paper like this. Sometimes these are the sections that are kind of folded onto itself, making it into a little bit more of like a paper bundle that the worms haven't really had access to yet. So I'll usually try to break that stuff up a little bit. This, I believe, was actually a tube, a toilet paper tube, cardboard. I think just by tearing it up that way, we're not going to recognize it as that again in the future. So I'm just looking for kind of hot spots where I can very easily scoop out a good number of worms on each go around. I have this kind of rough estimate here. What's this? This is like a big bundle of carrots, it looks like, maybe a tomato. All kinds of stuff the worms seem to really enjoy, as you can tell, just from the mass numbers of them that have collected here beneath it. I think I'd been operating on the assumption that this bin had maybe a couple thousand worms in it. I think 2 was the rough estimate. But I think a lot of people have already chimed in suggesting that there's probably well over 2,000 worms in this bin. And I think that was also part of the reason that I wasn't so worried about using these as bins to try to extract volunteers from. Because at first I had, looked at just the numbers that I had annotated in my record keeping, where I had, used the estimate of 2,000 as being the population in this bin. And I kind of disqualified these 2 newest bins because they both have that same estimated number of 2,000 worms in them. I thought to myself, well, a bin that only has 2,000 worms in it isn't a dense enough population to offer up some of its numbers for extraction. But when I start really looking at what's in this bin, I'm fairly certain that we've got well over 2,000 worms in here, making me less worried in terms of leaving this bin not having enough to continue. So I as you can see, even though we already kind of picked through the feeding area, we went out to the outskirts of the bin where there's been no food added, and it almost seems like we saw just as many worms hanging out over there as we observed hanging out in the freshly added food from a week ago. So I would have to guess that I pulled well over 1,000 worms out of here. So even though my goal was to pull out maybe 2 or so 2,000 worms, I mean, chances are we probably just pulled out about 1,500. There again, it's just a rough estimate. But if we do the same from the other bin, then we're going to ultimately be left with an extracted population closer to 3,000, which I'm sure will be just fine. All right. Just here, finding these scraps of large newspaper that had been used to contain the last feeding. I like to try to tear those up a little bit rather than leaving them all jumbled up like that and matted onto itself. This just makes it easier for the worms to utilize it as food if they should wish to do so. But you know what? I think here I am still thinking maybe I'm going to pull out one more handful of worms just because I'm seeing so many in here. So let's do that. I felt like I just came across a pretty large number of worms there. So chances are, when I go down the middle to add the newly applied food, I'll typically push everything else off to the sides, meaning all the stuff that gets pushed out to the left and to the right is the material that had been in the center. And all that stuff that was added as the feedings weeks and weeks ago keeps getting pushed outboard, and maybe that's the reason I always see so many worms hanging out on the outskirts of the bin and maybe not being as interested in the newly added food, is because the newly added food is stuff that they generally can't eat right away. They need to allow the microbes and the fungus and the bacteria and everything within the bin to sort of start breaking it down for them in advance, and then they can actually start taking advantage of it and consuming it. So perhaps that's the reason we always see so many worms on the outskirts of the feeding zones in my bins, is because the more mature and older food items that were put in there weeks and weeks ago have all been pushed to the outskirts, and that's the stuff that they like even better than the newly added food. So there again, just a theory, I'm not sure, but I think we're done here in terms of, extracting worms. So I'm going to bring in my collection of leaves that I bought in, and I thought that I'd kind of not use the paper bundling method today since I've got so many fresh leaves that I just bought down here. I figured I can just use fresh leaves as the bedding for them this time. So I'm going to lay in some of that on the bottom, and then I'm going to give them about half of what I bought down here, since I've got the other bin that I want to feed as well. I'm just going to go in here and scoop out what appears to be about half of what I bought down here. I think what remains is pretty much half, so we'll give a fair shake at what was brought down here for the other bin too. Make sure we can share it between both. And then I think we could start covering up this food. Oh, but you know what? Before I finish that, I wanted to apply a little grit again here. Can't remember if I had applied grit during last week's feeding, but I thought I would go ahead and apply some here today. So now I thought I would just kind of bring some of this partially broken down material in to help cover up some of this newly added bedding material. This is when I kind of get a little bit concerned that I might have left some of the stirred up food items that are maybe even difficult at this point to recognize as food, because it might be turning a little bit brown or might be covered in castings. So I usually prefer knowing that I've covered up all the food to the best of my ability, rather than just leaving it exposed to the surface out on top. So I think I bought plenty of leaves down here. I think what we're going to do now is just take some of that fresh leaves and we're just going to cover up the whole shebang with some fresh stuff, because look at this, I got pieces of whatever this is some sort of veggie sitting right there on the surface, and I'm sure that's not the only piece. So I think by putting a whole bunch of leafy stuff across the top, we'll we'll be creating some nice bedding material that the worms are probably going to enjoy cruising around in, but we'll also at the same time be covering up the food that could have been stirred up in the process. Look at all these big sticks, all these leaf stems. Those are the things that I know are going to take longer to break down in my worm bins, but hey, this is only a 34-day-old bin, right? I think there's plenty of time for that stuff to get broken down. Over time I might start adding less of this type of stuff, because just these little stems right here on the leaves, they have a tendency to take a really long time to break down. So I'll try to, in the future at least, I'll try to probably use fewer leaves as my bins mature in age. Try to use bedding materials that can break down a little bit more readily, so we don't have all kinds of stuff littering our finished compost when it comes time to harvest. All right, that was kind of cool. Always fun to pick around inside the worm bins, right? I guess that's why we're all here. It's always kind of an adventure. You never know quite what to expect. So I'm going to have to update my records here for this worm bin. And I'm pretty convinced that the 2,000 number that I have in my spreadsheet, which I think, amounts to multiple additions of worms over the course of time, maybe 1,000 here, maybe 500 here or there. Somehow I came up with the estimate of 2,000 worms being in this bin. And if in fact we took out in excess of 1,000 worms, then that would leave me with an estimated 1,000 worm population in here, which I think is drastically shy of what the real numbers are. So at this point I'm kind of abandoning, I think, my my worm count estimates, at least for this bin. And I'm almost tempted to leave the estimate as is in the spreadsheet. So despite, that large number of worms that we just removed from here, I'm still of that sense that this bin might still have about 2,000 worms in it, even after the extraction. So I'd love to hear people's thoughts on that. I won't even update my records right away. Maybe I'll put some sort of a placeholder in there so I don't forget to do some sort of an update to that record. But I'd love to hear what people think in terms of what they think the population of this bin is. And then we'll play the same game on the other bin too, because I think it's the same story there. So let's get this one out of here, and we'll go for the other one. All right, now this is the August 21 bin, which is now 66 days of age, just a little bit over 2 months of age. And here, you're going to notice something a little different. You know, obviously this bin does not have plastic covering it the same way as the last bin that we worked on had. This has only this paper covering it, as well as this other paper here, which is actually a little bit dry now, and that's a clear indication of the fact that, you know, newspaper covering your bin is still going to allow for a fair bit of evaporation. So, you know, even this coffee filter that's meant to indicate where I last fed, which is right down the middle, is fairly dry from having only that newspaper covering it, as are some of these scraps of bedding on the surface. So while it's always fun to poke into my bins that have plastic covering them, because I know there's always going to be worms on the surface to greet us, in this bin it seems completely normal to, you know, find pretty much no worms hanging out on the upper surface, because the upper surface is a little bit drier than the worms would like, and, you know, just by being submerged just a little bit below the surface, they're probably in a much more comfortable place. We'll do the same here. We're gonna, you know, peel into the last feeding area and see how many worms we're able to extract out of here. So I'm gonna bring back this container, and it's got a lot more weight to it now than it did before, that's for sure. So once we get done pulling worms out of here, I think we're gonna have a fairly good number. Wow, look at that. Lots of worms right there, hanging out right on the edge of where the feedings were getting put in. So let's see what we can do in terms of scooping some out. The material that they're occupying seems like it's a lot more castings. A lot more castings type material here. I'm feeling paper too, so I was just trying to avoid bringing the paper over, but maybe it's just easier to return it at the end. Otherwise, all that fiddling around gives the worms a chance to wriggle away and get out of reach, so I'm unable to scoop them out. But in certain places, when I reach down, I can definitely feel very large numbers of them right there on my fingertips. Here too, we can see some of the scraps from the previous feedings, and you would have to guess that right below that is where you're going to find your little hot spots of worms hanging out. Yeah, we're doing pretty good over here in terms of getting worms to come along for the ride. But you can see this bin, only being about a month older than the other one that we checked on, is clearly in a much further, more mature stage. There's, you know, you can't really tell that the material on the sides is leaves and cardboard and stuff. At this point, it does appear to be mainly castings, with some, you know, leafy bits and other bedding bits sprinkled throughout it. But when you compare it to the way the material on the outskirts of the bin we just worked on before looks, 1 month clearly makes a pretty big difference in terms of how far the worms can take it in that much time. Although that's, you know, it's just an observation on these two bins. There's always so many variables that could influence things that you don't really want to anticipate anything. You're just best off in most cases just, you know, being prepared to observe almost anything when you check in on your bins. Things can change quickly, things can deviate greatly between bins, so there's really I guess some rough measures that you can anticipate results by, but in most cases you're best off just, you know, being prepared for just about anything. So I think over on this side we're probably going to be able to pull out another good bunch of worms. Just trying to go a little bit offset from where the feedings were, so I don't bring a whole bunch of food along for the ride with each scoop. I like to leave castings behind too. Although I believe I'm going to try to scoop a lot of stuff out of here that's not worms, so that I can return it to this bin. Gotta say, this bin really looks great. Here again, this is the same deal. I had been populating these two bins in a way that I estimated here too. 2,000 worm population, although you got to admit this has got to be well over that. I don't think this is only 2,000 worms. Here again, I'm thinking, even though we just pulled out a whole bunch of worms, chances are we've actually still got a population in this bin that probably exceeds 2,000 worms even still, even after the extraction of all these worms. Gosh, I'm even questioning whether I need to take any more. I feel like I've got so many over here. You know what? I'm going to treat that as the last extraction, that handful right there. Try to return some of this food to the bin. Give these little guys a chance to dive down a bit, and that should enable me to skim even more stuff off the top that's not worms, and return it to this bin. That was the other difference between these two bins for some reason. It seemed like they, this bin always seemed like it had leftovers, as opposed to the other bin that always seemed like it had very few leftovers, which seemed a little bit unusual. I had no good, clear explanation as to why that might be. It's just another kind of little interesting oddity. And I find those differences interesting because I do attempt to run certain bins sort of side by side in very similar ways to one another, so that I can, you know, use the results I'm seeing in one or the other bin as a measure to see, you know, what to expect from the other bin. So in a way, if I see things going really one way or the other in either bin, sometimes I could use that as a troubleshooting tool, or at least some sort of an indication of, you know, what should I be expecting from each bin. But like I said earlier, you know, having that sort of a mentality is kind of good from a certain perspective, but you really don't want to go to the extreme of assuming anything, you know, because things can change really quickly. And I think that's the main reason we saw the first thing that we saw when we opened this thing, right, was the fact that there was no plastic covering this. There was only paper. And the main reason for that was because we did start seeing anomalies in this bin. We started noticing what appeared to be maybe a little bit more moisture than we were observing in the other bin. I think the other reason was we were starting to see these little creepy crawly bugs, which I think most people have, I think at this point, suggested that they were probably springtails, and I think I still see them to a certain degree, but certainly not in the amounts that we had observed previously, which had led me to want to run this bin with no covers for a while to allow for a little bit of drying, because I believe that it's a less damp environment that would help to reduce their numbers a little bit. And I do still see them, but I certainly don't see them in the numbers that I remember seeing last time. In fact, last time I think I even grabbed my phone and I was filming them close up, or I thought I was filming them close up. I was at least able to see them close up through the screen on the phone. Unfortunately, I didn't record that. I thought I had, and I thought we'd have some nice close-up view of those little creepy crawlies, but I forgot to hit record. So we didn't get that footage I was trying to get. But luckily we don't see as many of them now as we did previously, which is what I was after. It's exactly what I was after. So I'm glad to see that. I'm glad that there's not something worth filming in here, basically. So the same as we did before, I'm going to start pulling some of these freshly fallen, colorful autumn leaves to use as a bedding material underneath the food that I'm going to apply. That was a pretty good big bunch that I just pulled out there, maybe a little more than we need, but that's fine. But I love the colors. This one tree that's right outside my kitchen door that's just gotten done dumping the majority of its leaves into my yard. It just looks like the thing's on fire. It's got such incredible autumn colors. I always can hardly wait every year to see what that thing's going to look like. As vivid as they appear here in the worm bin, I got to tell you, they just look so much more incredible out on the tree because it's just so bright and incredible to see. There's also this food, so I'm thinking I'm just gonna empty the bag. And just visually speaking, it looks like we've managed to feed about the same amount here as we did in the other bin, I think. So that's cool. Let's apply some grit to this bin too. Why not, right? Although this bin, after being around for 2 months at this point, I usually operate on the assumption that all the grit that I'd added in the past is what I'm seeing when I look at some of the castings in my bins. You know, all those little white specks, besides the bugs. I typically assume that I've already got a fair bit of gritty material floating around in the bin already that can be used if needed by the worms. It's usually in the newer bins when it's pretty much a grit-free environment that I'm placing them into. That's just fresh bedding, paper, cardboard, stuff like that. It's into the newer bins that I prefer to make sure I'm not going a little skimpy on the grit. Make sure they've got a good, comfortable environment with good bedding, good food, but also the grit that they need to break down their food. So you can see here, not a worm to be seen. Just give them a few minutes and they dive right down into the material. So it's kind of good. It's the behavior I was anticipating, because I was hoping to start using this as the last step of peeling back, at least up until the point where I start observing a good number of worms, which I haven't really seen yet. So maybe they've just all gone straight on down to the bottom. But I wanted to return as much of this to the worm bins as possible, and see what I could do about extracting worms only here. You can see we're definitely getting to a layer where there's a good number of worms already, so I'm only going to scoop out another handful or two here. Then I'll let the bin sit again for a little while so that the worms can dive down again and hopefully give me an opportunity to scoop out even more of this casting material or uneaten food that we removed. Because I'm extracting worms, you know, I don't want to take out too much stuff that's not worms. Although leaving some of it behind is not a bad idea, because it's stuff that they can feed on. It's all stuff that's, you know, actively breaking down with the microorganisms that occupy the bins, making that stuff really good food for them. So I've already gotten down to the point where I'm almost hitting worms only at this point, and I think it's a good time to put these guys out in the bright light again, let them dive down a bit more. And I think before I close up shop here, I'm going to allow for a little bit more time so I could scoop even more of this stuff off the top. And then we'll pile that back in here. So let's leave a few minutes for that to occur. We'll come back in a moment. Well, it was a few minutes now, and I think the worms have retreated enough that I could probably skim a little bit more off again. I've also dumped out a lot of this green stuff over here, the little scraps of food that were still left in the bag that I had bought the food down here in. So I think if we skim carefully, we can limit what we're removing to only food and bedding type stuff, compost, and leave the majority of the worms behind, which is really what I'm after here. At some point though, I think, you know, it's going to be fair to assume that the greater majority of what's in this bin is mainly worms as opposed to anything else. Yeah, it's looking good. Here and there, I guess on the outer edges, maybe because it's a translucent container, maybe they're seeing the light on the very far edges, and they're even getting repelled from the walls of the container, maybe. Because the bright lights overhead are fairly bright. So if they're trying to get away from the bright light, then I could see them also wanting to get away from the sides of the container. So I definitely, man, so dense. I definitely feel like we've got ourselves a good couple pounds worth of worms in here. I'm even questioning whether it's going to be necessary to remove any more stuff out of here. I mean, it does look like there's a little bit of stuff here, little pockets of material that's not worms. I guess if it looks like I'm not going to end up pulling too many worms out in the process, I can try to grab a couple larger chunks of it. But at some point I think it's probably fine just to leave the rest of this and, you know, assume that maybe 90 or more % of what I have in here is just worms. I think at this point it probably is fair to say that that's probably the case, at least from the perspective of how much the weight that I'm feeling is. Because if I pull this stuff out here, you know, it occupies space, but it doesn't have the kind of weight that the worms themselves have. So I'm definitely getting down to a material that's almost worms only at this point. I'm curious how much it weighs. I might put it on the scale just so we can get a sense of it, and then we could use the old deduction method just to say, hey, you know, if it's not purely worms, then we have to deduct a certain % of that weight to estimate how many worms it is that we have here. So yeah, why don't I go grab the scale? I'm curious to see what we have here. So I've got the scale, and I can actually get the readings in both kilograms and pounds. And it displays it in pounds and ounces, so we can go for both measurements here. So I believe it's going to start up with pounds and ounces. No, it's actually in kilograms right now. So let's drop on the container, and we've got ourselves 0.92 kilograms. And, you know, I don't know what percentage of that is plastic container and non-worm material. But, you know, if we were to deduct maybe, you know, 10% or whatever, then we're down to maybe, you know, 8.8 or 0.85 kilograms. If we switch over to pounds and ounces, we've got, oh, not even, you know, I'm assuming that we're probably maybe a pound and a half here. You know, I was really thinking I'd end up with more. But that's fine, I guess. I don't really want to go rummaging around to pull out even more worms at this point. I've pretty much rebuilt these beds. I think for now that should be a satisfactory amount of red wigglers for my purpose. And no, we're not going to be doing a worm release here. I've actually offered the worms to a friend of mine, and so that's where they're going. I don't know if I mentioned that earlier. So even though in most cases we would be proceeding to the release of these worms that we've collected here, that's not the case. So hopefully I didn't set anyone's expectations incorrectly. So the only thing left here to do is to cover up these worms at this point. So I've still got a whole bunch of leaves to use here, and I think what I'm going to do is I'll do the same as I did in the other bin. I'm just going to try to level things off here to the best of my ability, just using whatever it is that we shoved aside in the beginning. Then I'll just use fresh leafy matter to cover up the entire top surface of what's going on here. And I think that that should probably provide them with a nice cozy spot to wander around in. You know, with only newspaper covering this bin at this point, the top surface of this material has sort of become a no man's land. Too dry for the worms, I guess. But if we cover the whole shebang with a whole bunch of leaves, I would have to assume that the worms are going to come up into that top layer to explore those leaves a little bit more than if there was just newspaper across the top. If there were just newspaper across the top here, then we would probably not expect to see too many worms hanging out. So I guess this is a good opportunity for me to try to clear my gloves of some of the castings material that collected on it, rather than rinsing it down the drain when I get to cleaning things up here. And besides, it's going to be a nice colorful array of autumn yellows and oranges and reds to give me a little surprise the next time I peek into these bins. And you saw the material's consistency. It's really nice. So I think I am almost ready to start putting plastic back across the top so as to not lose too much moisture. But I don't want to do that too prematurely, because if you remember, the reason for removing the plastic on this bin, the reason was to try to reduce the amount of those creepy crawlies that I'd observed at one point a while ago. And I wouldn't want to kind of undo that good result that I think we're seeing here of fewer creepy crawlies. So I don't want to change too many things at once. I think we're just going to continue to stick with allowing for more evaporation to occur here, but hopefully stifle it a little bit with that leaf cover. So we'll see how it goes. All right, everyone. That's it for today. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, please remember to give me a thumbs up. That's always really appreciated. And if you haven't done so already, please consider subscribing to the channel too. That's always really appreciated as well. All right, everyone. Thanks so much for watching. Have a great day. Bye now.